Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing fine out there tonight and have had a good summer, very wild summer of events and all sorts of things. Hopefully, some of you have made it to some of our summer events. So tonight, first presentation of our autumn and winter season, which is creating woodland through natural colonisation and natural processes, which is presented by Sian Atkinson of the Woodland Trust, and is going to look at different methods that can be used to help natural recolonisation of trees and shrubs, and a little bit about what funding and support is available to help. One of the things I must remind you all beforehand, if you want to ask questions, feel free to do so. We're going to use the Q&A bit, which you should see on your Zoom link along the bottom. So feel free to use the chat as well, but specifically for questions, use the Q&A link. I just want to do a little recap of a few things first before we introduce Sian. We tend to record all of our webinars, so we have a wonderful resource on YouTube of all our previous webinars, and you can actually get a link through the website if you go to the resources section of the Yorkshire Rewilding Network website and down to the YRN webinars. You can go directly from there to the YouTube channel, but they're also embedded in that particular web page. So as mentioned, the website, we obviously have a website that is pretty active with blogs and stories, and the events page shows all of our up and coming events as well. For those of you who are on the professional LinkedIn network, we also have presence on LinkedIn, so do join the group. We also now have a Facebook page as well. And then if you're not already on our chat forum, which is hosted by Mighty Networks, there is a link from the website as well to join that and become an active participant, hopefully. I just want to draw you also to your attention to the map that we have on the website. And we keep this pretty active and up to date. So it just shows a number of projects that have been submitted so far across the Yorkshire region, across a number of different categories, and there's a number of different things you can do with the map. And each little pin, if you pick it, there's a little pop-up that has information about that particular project site and potentially links if they have links that you can find out more information from, and potentially how you'd go around arranging a site visit to that project as well. So that's on the website. And if you do have a project that's not actually on the website at the minute, do get in touch. The page under Rewilding in Action, the map page there has a link so you can submit your own project. Okay, so how can you support us? Well, we are a charity. We do everything based on voluntary donations and occasional grants. And if you are able to help us in any way, I'd love to draw your attention to the support us section on the website, where you can link through to make donations or text them through to us. And also just to draw your attention all to the Wild 100 Club as well, which is a little bit more substantial, a little bit more of a commitment. But again, that's on the website and you'll see that under the About Us section. Finally, before I hand over to Sian, just a little bit about our November webinar, which is an update on the Cropton Beaver Trial. For those of you who are aware of the Cropton Beaver Trial, it's over on the North York Moors in North Yorkshire. So it's been going for 5 years. So Kath Bashford is going to give us an update at the end of November for that. So if you go to the events page on the website, you'll be able to link through and register for that once we post the link. Okay, so I'll hand over to Sian now. So Sian is the Senior Outreach Manager for the Woodland Trust in Northern England. She leads a team of advisors who work with landowners and partners to support the expansion of native tree cover across Yorkshire, and also supports sustainable management of ancient woodland as well. And over a 30-year career at the Woodland Trust, Sian's worked as a site manager. She's worked on policy and evidence projects at a national level and has a particular interest in woodland ecology. So Sian, if you're all ready to go, I shall hand across to you.
Yeah. So I'll just share my screen to kick off. Hopefully. Okay, is that showing the right?
Yes, it is.
Screen? Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, I've been working in woodland for a long time. It's absolutely amazing to see so many people on this webinar interested in rewilding and interested in hearing about creating new woodland through natural processes. I hadn't really come across the Yorkshire Rewilding Network before offering to do this talk, and it's very exciting to see such a lot of interest. I'm guessing there's a mix of people on this webinar, from maybe some who have land ownership, but also others who just have a general interest in the topic. So I'm going to try and pitch things so that there's things of interest to everybody. So I'm going to cover a little bit about, why we might want to use natural processes to create woodland, the sort of factors you might need to consider, and a little bit about the kind of funding available as well. And while I'm talking about woodland in this presentation, I'm just very mindful that woodland, it's not always just about closed canopy woodland. Sometimes we might be looking at mosaics of wooded habitats, or creation of wood pasture, or creation of scrubby habitats. And I want you to sort of have that in mind when I'm talking about woodland creation, rather than just sort of, even-aged woodland. Okay. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of definitions, because there's some quite confusing terminology that ends up being used around this whole topic. You'll hear natural processes, natural colonisation, and natural regeneration all being used, sometimes interchangeably. So the Forestry Commission tends to focus on natural regeneration being more about new trees growing through seeding, through a natural way, on areas that have already been wooded. So if you have a woodland that's been clear felled and then it regenerates with new trees, then that's what we would think of as natural regeneration. Although back in the day when I first started working in woodland conservation, we used that term also to talk about colonisation on bare land. But generally now we're thinking of it more as within existing woodland. And then in terms of new areas, so when trees are seeding onto bare land, we would call that natural colonisation. At the Woodland Trust, we tend to talk about natural processes, because we kind of like to capture the idea that it's not just about, going from bare land to a woodland, but actually there's a whole process going on, and that can take quite a long time to establish, and it can be dynamic, and it can be a sort of, almost like an eternal process, really. So I think the whole idea that what we're doing is trying to get processes in action rather than necessarily, creating a fixed endpoint is a good one to think about. So in terms of creating woodland, you could imagine you've got three different ways that we can create woodland. So the one we're probably all familiar with, we see a lot of pictures of the plastic tree tubes in the ground. So trees that are grown from seed and then brought to a site and then planted. We can also talk about direct seeding. So it's a kind of in between, really, where we might bring seed to the site and scatter that and broadcast it, or, even sow that seed in order to try and kickstart some tree establishment on the site. Or we can go for natural colonisation, where we just leave it to nature and hope that trees are going to come in. But quite often on sites that we work on, we actually do a combination of 2 or even 3 of those things, because it's often the case that just leaving everything completely to nature doesn't always work as well as you would want it to create the endpoint that you're looking for. So thinking about it as maybe a mixed approach. So why would we use natural processes or natural colonisation? Well, I guess the first reason really is that trees that have arrived and that then thrive on a site naturally are likely to be successful. They're likely to be adapted to the site conditions. The trees that actually succeed on that site likely to be adapted to the site conditions. Allowing that kind of natural colonisation may promote more genetic diversity and more resilience, more adaptation to a site than, bringing in seed that you've grown in a nursery and then bringing the trees in. And then thinking about that kind of whole process that I was talking about, so that natural colonisation, can happen through, first of all, scrubby elements developing, maybe thorn, hawthorn, even gorse, something that will create a kind of spiny protective area that then the other trees can grow up in, that protects them from being browsed on. But that scrubby, pioneer phase of the woodland development has its own biodiversity value. It's like a transitional habitat. So the site might move through different phases, and each of those has its own value. Often with natural colonisation, you will get much more of a patchy sort of structure to the site. So some areas where things establish more quickly, or different species established. So it can feel more naturalistic, and it's also quite interesting and quite diverse. So you can get these really quite complex mosaics of vegetation with variable species, structures and densities, and that can have a higher ecological value than just a plantation of fairly uniform vegetation. Other reasons really are that, for example, if you allow for natural colonisation, the roots may be healthier and establish better on those trees, often transplanting trees, lifting them from the nursery, bringing them into a site and then planting them, especially if that planting is not done terribly well, the roots actually suffer in that process, so the trees don't always establish very well. It's actually generally it's cheaper. It's much cheaper generally if it's successful to create woodland through natural colonisation. You can also avoid the use of plastics or minimise the use of plastics. So if you're fencing off an area to allow for natural colonisation, then you're not protecting every individual tree. And also those kind of biosecurity risks, so the risks of moving diseases around by transplanting trees from one place to another are minimized as well. So there's lots and lots of reasons why natural colonization is a good way to go. And the picture on the screen shows Monk's Wood, which is in Cambridgeshire, which is one of the longest running kind of trials of natural colonization. And you can just see, I use that picture because you can just see all the blossom on the scrub there, just showing what a fantastic kind of habitat that is for pollinators, for example. UK Forestry Standard, which is our standard for sustainable forestry, suggests using natural colonisation, especially around ancient woodlands. So where you've got woods that have been there for at least 400 years, to try and conserve that distinctive genetic material within those woods. Natural colonisation is a good way to do that. So you'd think, well, why would anybody ever plant woods at all if it's so great to do it by natural processes? So it kind of depends partly on what your objectives are. So if you're looking to create woodlands in a relatively short time scale, then natural processes can be very unpredictable. The timescales can be much longer and just uncertain whether it'll actually establish at all. Your species composition is very dependent on what seed comes in and what seed's available, or how seed is moved around. If you've got particular species you want there and there's just no seed source, anywhere nearby, you're probably not going to get them. So the success rate is lower and is variable, and timescales it takes longer. And you also really kind of need to keep an eye on things. So if you set off on this trajectory towards creating a woodland through natural processes, you can just walk away and leave it. But then if it's not working, then you're kind of losing time. And so really, if we were doing a scheme of that kind, we would be monitoring it really regularly to see what's happening and see if there's any further interventions that are needed. So it can be a little bit more time consuming or resource intensive in that sense. So let's say you've decided you want to do your woodland creation scheme through natural processes. So what kind of things do you need to think about? Well, I've mentioned already that the seed source is really important. But it's not just seed source, it's also, some trees will spread by suckering, so that you might actually get some vegetative spread of trees from suckers. So that's one option, but obviously that's only within a certain distance initially of those parent trees. So generally speaking, most of the successful natural colonization that happens next to an existing woodland is within about 100 meters of the woodland edge itself. So within a certain time, reasonable time scale. The further away you get from that woodland edge, the less colonization you get. So that's kind of partly about those timescales I was talking about, but partly about how far seed will spread. So some species do have very light seed that's wind blown. I mean, birch, for example, will come in almost anywhere. Even if there's not a birch tree in sight, you'll often find birch coming in. Other trees require dispersal agents, so they may need to be transported in bird droppings, or you know, oaks famously, you know, squirrels and jays planting acorns, especially those bigger, heavier seeds. So you've got to think about, what are the dispersal agents? What are the animals or birds or, you know, other factors that will disperse those seeds, and are they present on that site? What's the prevailing wind direction, for example, relative to nearby woodland? So thinking about all of those things and seed actually getting to your site. And then the other thing is really, if your seed gets there, is it going to germinate? So for germination, most tree seeds do require access to exposed soil. So if you've got a site that's been pasture for a long time, for example, and it's got a very closed sward of grass, a dense sward, then it's going to be difficult for those seeds to get in and establish. And then even if they do establish, they need ongoing light and water and nutrients. So if there's very competitive other vegetation on the site, then, you know, they may not thrive. So you need to think about what the vegetation is that's already on the site. So generally speaking, colonisation is often faster on quite nutrient poor soils, where there's less competitive vegetation. If you've got a plough pan, so if the site's been ploughed and you get that kind of compacted layer below the surface, that can impede the drainage, that can affect the establishment of the trees. Same is true for planted trees, actually. So, you know, often on woodland creation sites, we try and break up that plough pan before we try and establish trees on it. So you might also then want to scarify, you know, cut the vegetation, then scarify to create that bare soil, to allow to create, I suppose, a seed bed to allow the seeds to establish, but without too much disturbance of the soil. You'd need to think about predation. So have you got a lot of deer in the area? Because if you have, then deer pressure on new seedlings, you know, can just prevent any natural regeneration or natural colonization establishing. So you may have to think about fencing against deer, against rabbits, against, you may need to think about control of mammals, herbivores, to allow those trees to establish. So there is guidance available. So on the screen, I've put this Forestry Commission guidance on using natural colonisation for creation of new woodland. It's a really excellent guidance booklet that sets out quite a lot of these factors. You know, one way that you might want to create the right conditions, though, for natural colonisation is through grazing. So cattle, for example, you know, as well as reducing the sward, they'll also create areas of open ground, you know, with their hooves on the soil, you know, can break up areas that then create conditions for seed. So doing some mob grazing, for example, like sort of quite intensive grazing for certain areas and then moving the animals on, can create that seed bed. And we're certainly looking at trying some of those methods. And then you might want to create features that will encourage some of those dispersal agents. So, for example, perching posts for birds, so that, you know, the droppings will then fall on the areas below if they're likely to contain tree seed. So there's lots and lots of things you can do. Probably I should also mention, though, first, that before you do any of that, you need to assess, is your site actually suitable for woodland creation? So just the same as if you were planting a site or planting a new woodland, you'd need to think about, you know, are there existing other important habitats there? Is there areas of archaeological importance? Are there, you know, other features that we might want to avoid, like power lines or, you know, underground utilities? Because the end result, obviously, if you're creating a woodland, is exactly the same if you're planting. So I wasn't going to go into a lot of detail about the regulatory framework about woodland creation, because it is quite complicated and fairly onerous, but really just to say that if you're creating a woodland intentionally through natural colonisation, you just need to think about all of the same factors that you would if you were planting. Okay, so I was just going to run you through a couple of case studies as well that I'm aware of, that where natural colonisation has been used. So Hucking Estate in Kent is a Woodland Trust site. It's been running since 2004. So this is a fairly long-running site. And it's one of those that's been a real success. So, you know, the area was formerly farmland. Some areas on the site had been wooded in the past, but they had been cleared by the mid-20th century. So they've been sort of farmed for at least kind of 50 years. The area of natural colonisation on that site is around 40 hectares, so it's quite big. It's with, yeah, about 5 hectares was set aside in 2004, and then another 35 hectares in 2017. And so far, it's been really successful. So there was some tree planting was carried out on the site in nearby areas, but the natural colonisation was adjacent to existing areas of trees and woods. So where there are woodlands of oak and ash and hornbeam and field maple, and some mature individual oak trees as well near the area that was set aside in 2017. There was no ground preparation carried out and no maintenance carried out on the site to weed the trees or clear around them or anything. And yet this site has been successful. And it's regenerated with oak, hawthorn, willow, blackthorn, field maple and hazel. So quite a big variety of tree species as well. So why has it been really successful? Well, one of the reasons I think is that there's not really any deer in the area. So had there been, you know, big deer populations, I think there would have been less success. The ground conditions, perhaps with some areas having formerly been wooded, you know, even though they have since been farmed, you know, perhaps the ground conditions were a bit more favourable. But really, sometimes it's a bit of a mystery as to why a particular site succeeds, because even in 2017 is fairly recent, you know, deer populations have increased over the years that I've been working on woodlands, and you know, I would have expected to have a bit more of a challenge to natural processes or natural colonisation with more recent areas than that, but it seems to have been really successful. And you know, we're not entirely sure for all of the reasons for that. And then this is Pepperwood, which is a Woodland Trust site in the West Midlands. And I've just put this one in because it's quite an interesting one. So we're doing quite a lot of trials here and kind of monitoring and trying to gather data. So it's the extension to an existing ancient woodland. So it's got a good seed source next to it. It's a mixture of planting and direct seeding and natural colonisation being used on this site. And we've been trialling different ground preparation techniques in the natural colonisation areas to see what difference they make. So it's an ongoing research project, so I don't have all of the results for that. But what we're looking at is the difference between, for example, mob grazing, chain harrowing, stripping the turf of these experimental areas to see if there's a difference in the way that the trees colonize. And the reason that we're doing this is because there's actually so little research and data and evidence around natural colonization, what works and what doesn't work. I feel like in this country we've sort of ended up defaulting always towards planting rather than, you know, doing the sort of slightly more difficult, slightly more high risk, slightly more experimental approach of natural colonization. And largely that's, you know, partly been because the grants for woodland creation have driven you towards the safer bet, if you like. So we felt that, you know, if we can, we should be trying to experiment with this. So that's what we're doing at Pepperwood. And that kind of leads me on a little bit to the funding that's available for this sort of approach. So in Yorkshire, as an example, we've got there's three main different types of funding, all of which will fund natural colonisation for woodland creation. So there's the England Woodland Creation Offer, which is UCO, which is the Forestry Commission's grant offer. That's England-wide, and it funds both planting schemes and natural colonisation. There's Trees for Climate, which is administered by the community forests. So the map on the right there shows you where the community forests in England are, and you'll see that Yorkshire and the north generally are very well covered by community forest. So the White Rose Forest is that biggest area there, but including Leeds and York. They have a good grant scheme for natural colonisation alongside planting. And then Grow Back Greener is a grant that covers the northern forest. So that's the bottom map, which includes some of the community forest, but that's a grant scheme that's administered by the Woodland Trust. So that's actually the one I'm most familiar with working for the Woodland Trust. And it's all of those grants come out of a pot of money that DEFRA made available through its Nature for Climate Fund to try and accelerate woodland creation in this country. So I'm going to talk mostly about Grow Back Greener because it's the one I'm most familiar with, but I'm not necessarily saying it's the best grant in every case. I think all of these different grants, they're kind of similar, but they've got slight differences. So it might depend on what site somebody has, what method they want to use, what their objectives are as to which grant is actually going to work best for them. But if I talk about Grow Back Greener, just assume that there's kind of slight differences with the others, but there are other funding streams available. All of them, I would say, are a lot more flexible and I'm not quite sure what the word is, less onerous, I suppose, in a way, or less stringent than the previous, so back in the day, the woodland creation grants that they used to be for natural colonisation, were really a little bit unrealistic in the kind of stocking densities of trees that they expected by a certain time. So people tended not to take those grants up so much because of the risk in not being able to achieve those stocking densities. So Grow Back Greener is a grant for new native woodland. We offer a kind of really enhanced advisor support, so real hand-holding for the landowner right from start to finish. We pay up to 100%, usually it is 100% of the capital costs of the woodland creation and any management interventions that are needed for establishment, and that's based on actual costs rather than a standard cost. For natural processes scheme, we would do annual monitoring visits for 5 years. And then if along the way things weren't quite working and we weren't quite achieving the level of woodland establishment we wanted, and if more interventions were needed, we might then be able to fund additional items. And then if we do achieve that stocking density, we kind of have a little bonus payment at year 5 or year 10. So in theory, we want woodlands established by year 5, but with natural processes, you really do often need to give it longer so we can extend the period over which that's achieved. We have quite flexible payment options, and we ask landowners to enter a 15-year legal agreement. So that's kind of the rough shape of the grant. But I suppose what I wanted to really say about Grow Back Greener as a grant is that the reason we set it up the way that we did is that what we actually want is people to have the opportunity to work with landowners to try different approaches and experiment, and encourage people to maybe take a bit of risk, maybe to try a different approach, from what they would have done otherwise, and help them along the way. So our end aim is not to sort of be taking grant back from people because they haven't succeeded. It's to look at what is it we need to do to achieve that woodland creation, and thereby to add to the body of evidence, which I was previously saying is somewhat thin, on what works and what doesn't work on different types of sites for woodland creation by natural colonisation. So that was our kind of aspiration with this grant programme. So there are certain criteria. So the site needs to be within 75 metres or so of a seed source. There's a kind of minimum area that we look at, just really because otherwise it becomes quite resource intensive to administer the grant if they're very, very tiny areas. We can have it open space included, shrubs are included, etc. So what we're looking for is for a site to have 400 additional trees and shrubs by year 5 or year 10 on more difficult sites. And the trees must achieve a height of 0.5 metres by year 5 or 10. So this is where the slight differences between the grants. So for example, UCO has different criteria. So it requires the site to have 60% woody cover, but that's actually quite a broad definition. It can include things like bramble. And then And then within that, there needs to be at least 100 trees per hectare by year 10. So, and they have a grant that's based on standard costs for capital items and so on. But they also have some supplements for sites that meet particular criteria. So trying to compare the different grants is really difficult because it's very dependent on your site and what you need to pay for on that site as to what's best. And what we try and do is all of the different organisations offering these grants, we try and work together as one team and try and make sure that the end result is that the landowner gets the scheme or the grant that's best for them. So for us, I would say the uptake has been fairly slow on Grow Back Greener, and I think the same is probably true of the other grant funders for natural colonisation. The bigger schemes that we've had have tended to be with landowners who are conservation NGOs like ourselves, so organisations that have that as a real conservation aim and perhaps are in a position to take more risk than a private landowner. The smaller schemes that we've done with private landowners have tended to be often natural colonisation in a mix of a larger scheme that will also include some planting. And the kind of landowners that we find that private landowners that this approach appeals to are definitely those who've got an interest in rewilding, those who've got a real conservation mindset, and often those who are wanting to reduce carbon footprint as well, so minimising the use of plastics. So we're trying to think, well, how can we, because we do feel this is a good approach, natural colonisation. We want to see more woodlands created that way. But how can we make it more appealing to landowners? I think we need more evidence and more case studies showing how it can actually work. Okay, so just running through a few of the schemes that I'm aware of that I would put under the banner of natural colonisation or natural processes. I think many of you will be aware of Wild Ingleborough, which is Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. It's a partnership project, but led by Yorkshire Wildlife Trust in the Yorkshire Dales. We do have part of that site has gone into a Grow Back Greener natural colonisation grant, but I'm kind of more interested in just sort of looking at the project as a whole, where I think the land management vision and the objectives that the Wildlife Trust have there, where they want to bring more cattle grazing in and allow a mosaic of habitats to sort of develop naturally. So there are small areas of regeneration or regrowth of trees and shrubs happening already where sheep have been removed on that site. I'm sure many of you are probably more familiar with this site than I am, so I'm happy to be corrected if I say anything wrong. So yeah, and I know that they've been using the sort of no fence collars for the cattle to sort of move them to where they want them to be, so that they can help, the cattle can actually help to create the right conditions for that kind of mosaic of habitats to develop. So what's interesting, I think, with Wild Ingleborough is that we've been sort of on the steering group and kind of trying to be a helping partner in that project for a few years now. And so this little area, Belford's pasture, actually has gone through the Grow Back Greener grant programme. The bluish areas were areas of supplementary planting to help provide a seed source, and then the rest of it is sort of left for natural colonisation. There were other areas in the project that we thought might go through Grow Back Greener, but I think one of the issues with having a grant programme that is effectively coming from a government pot of money which is there to create woodland for carbon reasons, so afforestation, it kind of almost has a, there's a sort of prescriptive number of trees or amount of tree cover that DEFRA are looking for through that. And although we can be fairly flexible with that, we do have to still sort of try and meet that. And I think sometimes when you're doing a rewilding, often when you're trying to do a rewilding project, your approach is more, well, let's, it might not be a defined endpoint. It might be, you know, a broad vision for the site of the kinds of things you want to see, but then it is about letting nature take its course and see what happens. So I guess one of the things I'm interested in, I'm really happy for people to ask questions or raise this in the Q&A, is, you know, how much is woodland creation in a fairly prescriptive way through natural processes? How much is that rewilding, or is it something slightly different, you know, and how can we get grants that actually better foster that kind of process, that kind of ecological dynamism that we want to see, rather than necessarily being fixated on a defined endpoint? Discuss. I'm very happy to hear people's thoughts on that. Okay. So another scheme that we've done is this one's in the Peak District. It's in Edale. It's been it's National Trust this time. So I did say that a lot of the bigger schemes are NGOs. The Peak District National Park Authority have worked on it. And I put this one in because National Trust, they're wanting to sort of increase biodiversity, create more kind of naturalistic transitions within the landscape, so more ecotones within the landscape. So they've been doing the ground preparation they've done has been by mob grazing with cattle to try and break up the sward and create those opportunities for trees to seed in and grow. And they're aiming to have at least, well, to have 40% open space left at the end of it, so it's not kind of going to be wall-to-wall woodland. So this one's underway, and there'll be kind of, we're at the point of, you know, starting the scheme, and we'll be looking at monitoring that every year over the next 5 years to see how that goes. And then this one is probably a more typical scheme that we would work, my advisors would work on with a private landowner. So it's quite a bit smaller. It's a mixture of planting, so the lighter green area is a planted area within a deer fence, so there's no plastic tubes. The landowner was very keen not to use plastic, but we have deer fenced the area, and we've planted at quite high stocking density to allow for losses as well, from, you know, should there be voles or rabbits or whatever. And then the stripy bits are the natural processes areas. So again, these have been prepared with so, you know, cutting the sward and then using a chain harrow to break up the ground a bit and create the seed bed. So the natural processes areas are all next to existing woodland, which is ancient woodland. So we're looking at sort of trying to buffer that ancient woodland, protect it from the impacts of surrounding land use, but also use that seed source from the ancient woodland to create the new areas. So far the planted trees are doing really well. One of the things we've noticed with the natural processes areas is that since fencing those off and preventing the stock from getting into the existing ancient woodland, the existing woodland has suddenly, because it was being grazed with sheep, you know, sheep were getting into the wood, the existing woodland has suddenly sort of really blossomed, and the ground floor is fantastic in there now, whereas it had been looking really sparse. So that's quite encouraging. It's not just the trees, but actually some of that flora will then be able to eventually colonize the new areas. And there's it's early days for the natural colonization, because they're still at the point of doing the ground preparation for that. But yeah, looking forward to seeing how that one goes. And then the final example that I've got is a very rocky site with some existing trees. You can see areas where there are existing trees on the site. So what's interesting about this one is that we think it might be what's called a ghost wood. So it's part of the site's been wooded again, but is now not. But we're hoping that it will colonize quite easily because of that, and it's got some trees there as a seed source. So the land's going to be grazed with belted galloways, and then deer fence installed, and then hopefully we'll see some trees establishing there. So just very quickly to talk about the type of monitoring we do. So we've been trying to develop a bit more of a kind of formal method for monitoring these sites, because you know, it's not just a question really of just going in and counting trees. So we're looking at using UK halves as a sort of basis. So looking for 80% of the site by year 5 or 10 to be in one of the approved categories in UK HAB. So for example, W1 broadleaf mixed woodland, or H3, which is scrub. So just looking at the kind of categories that would be appropriate, and just as a way of recording what we're seeing on the site and how much of the site is within those categories. But we would also do more detailed vegetation survey as well. So just looking at what flora species there are and what ground layer there is in the site and how that is changing. And we'd also do fixed point photography as well, so that we can see visually how the site's changing over time. So that's kind of, again, this is experimental. We're literally going to be doing this year one this coming year. So we'll see how that goes and whether it works as a method. But if anyone's got thoughts on that, I'd be very interested as well. So finally, just wanted to mention this project. So this is a project run by, well, it's a partnership. It's a research partnership of forest research, a number of universities, including Stirling, Edinburgh, University of London, Woodland Trust are one of the partners. And it's called Tree Planet, which is a slightly clunky title, but tree expansion through planting and natural colonisation. And it's basically looking at both the social and ecological aspects of planting and natural colonisation and everything in between, which is that kind of direct seeding or a mixture of different approaches, just to see how we can maybe use those to scale up woodland expansion. So coming out of that research collaboration has been quite a lot of resources. So there's a brochure with a whole load of case studies, including some of the ones that I've mentioned, like the Hucking Estate, but many others across the UK, looking at how natural colonisation has proceeded or not on some of those sites and where it's worked, and just kind of comparing those. There's a whole load of webinars about different aspects around natural colonisation, including the ecology, the ecological aspects. There's another one coming up quite soon, I think. And then there's plans for some kind of guidance as well, some practical guidance to be produced on natural colonisation. So watch that space, really. I think that's going to be really interesting. I think that project's just coming to an end now, and they're kind of writing up the final bits. And that's really the end of my presentation. Sorry, it feels like it's been going on a long time, but I hope there's time for some questions and any comments or discussion. I'd be very happy to try and answer.
Thank you. That was wonderful. You had me right at the start about diverse mosaics of habitats, not just lots of trees. So really heartening to see the progression of the Woodland Trust and others, and to encourage that kind of landscape. And you really brought that to life for us with examples and in our region. So thank you for that. And I would also say really impressive sort of mental clarity, given that you shared with us that you became a grandmother for the first time yesterday. So we're really pleased that you did that for us.
Yeah, quite tired right now.
It doesn't show. So we've got a good few questions already. Do please add more in if you would like to, but couple at the start on sort of species mix, if I may, Sian.
Yeah.
First one is, will you always require native tree species, or have you done mapping of future climate scenarios and which natives may not survive?
Right, really good question. So I would say, as Woodland Trust, if it was our site, we would be looking for a native woodland. So, and often we would be if it's a Woodland Trust site, we'd often be creating next to an ancient wood, because one of our aims is always to try and protect and buffer ancient woods. So we'd be looking for, that kind of genetic pool to be expanded out. But I think if you're looking broader than just what we might be doing, I think it really depends on what your objectives are on a site. So the evidence around using different species or different provenances, if you are planting, for example, is that, for conservation purposes, for ecological purposes, actually our native trees have a lot of what's called plasticity, a lot of adaptability to potential future climate scenarios, more so than people might think. So if you're looking for a conservation woodland, that it's not necessarily the case that you would need to think about adding in different species or whatever. If you're thinking about timber, it's maybe a different matter. And, you know, we do also need timber in this country. We import more timber than than any other country other than China. So, you know, although my remit here is to talk about woodland conservation and native woodland, that there is also a need to think about timber trees. So generally speaking, though, obviously you're going to be looking at what there is in the area. If you're looking for, you know, what's going to come into a site. So I suppose the other question is, if stuff comes in and you don't want it, what do you do? So would you take it out? So if you've got species that aren't native and your aspiration is for a native woodland, you know, is it a problem if you've got a few non-native species in there? Again, I think that partly depends on what you define as native or non-native. People talk about honorary natives or near natives or naturalized species. So things like sycamore and sweet chestnut and other things that, you know, have been established here a very long time. And something like sycamore plays a really key role, I think, in providing some of the habitats and niches and conditions that used to be provided more by elm and ash, for example. So, you know, we don't discount it. We certainly don't, you know, sort of remove it from all our woods or anything. So I guess I'm kind of hedging my bets a bit and saying it depends. It's not a yes or a no.
It always does with rebranding.
But it really does depend on your objectives on what seed is available, yeah, and your site and what's actually going to establish there.
Thank you. A couple of species-specific ones. I don't know how your knowledge on the ecology of specific species is, but I'll try them for you. Why does small-leaved lime so rarely grow from seed?
It's something to do with climatic conditions, I think. It just doesn't germinate very well. I know we really struggle to get stock to plant of small-leaved lime because the germination rates are appalling. So yeah, I think it might be something to do with climatic conditions, but you are testing me a little bit on that one.
No, that's all right. We'll move swiftly on.
I know that. So for example, I know that its range does appear to be expanding slightly with climate change, with the warming climate. I know that it seems to be regenerating or setting seed better in more northerly areas than it used to, just marginally, but yeah, okay. I've come across that.
Conversely, a comment about oak being a pioneer species. Does that grow more successfully in colonisation schemes rather than in mixed, heavily planted schemes?
Yeah, good question. So I think that oak, I think of oak as being a light demanding species. It's a species that requires light, and it will often germinate better in a light open area than it will under canopy in an existing woodland. So yes, it will, you know, it will establish in a planted area as well. But if it's very densely planted, or it's densely planted with other faster growing species, it can get overtopped by the faster growing species and not establish so well. So it will establish through planting and through natural colonisation. It's often about the conditions that are there, you know, for it, as to whether it succeeds or not. So okay. That kind of light and competition and things like that.
Thank you. Couple of questions about sort of early stages and getting things started. That management of bracken prior to natural colonisation.
Yeah, so I've seen instances where people have, yes, I mean, things won't establish well in dense bracken, so you need to do something. Mechanical cutting, but over very large areas, that's very resource intensive. But I have seen a project recently where that's the intention, to do that over quite large areas, but to do it maybe a bit at a time over successive years rather than trying to do it all in 1 year. You know, crushing and rolling it, cattle can be quite good for going in and breaking up bracken, but when there's an awful lot of it, you know, you need to kind of move the cattle purposefully through it and into it, I suppose. And then there's an issue with, you know, not wanting them to sort of be eating it too much. But yeah, it's problematic, you know, and spraying's not really a very good option. So mechanical cutting's often often the only
Not an easy one, but at
option.
least if you can get the woodland growing, then it should shade out the bracken in time. Yeah, thank you. Have you done any trials with establishing bramble, wild raspberry, gooseberry, etc., to facilitate natural recolonisation within grassland?
No, not really. I mean, I think not with bramble, etc. No, not deliberately. I've seen it happen naturally. not deliberately putting it in. You know, we more likely we would plant sort of thorny shrub species and maybe plant, you know, rather than for natural colonization, but maybe plant thorny shrub trees in with, you know, maybe a taller tree that we want to grow. But I haven't tried it with bramble, and I'm not aware of any trials with that. No, it's quite an interesting thought though.
A sort of further one on the early stages of establishment. What's the latest thinking on inoculating roots with mycorrhizae and whether that really helps? Is it worth translocating leaf litter from nearby, or woody material help with establishment?
Yeah, I'm always a little bit concerned about these sort of commercial mycorrhizal products, and I don't know that much about them, but I think I have a sort of slightly precautionary approach to them as to whether you just need to be, I suppose, just being careful that you're not potentially causing a problem rather than improving things. So depending on, you know, what are the species that you're inoculating with, I feel like I'm not really enough of an expert to comment, but I'd always be quite cautious about what I'm putting on those trees. I know that there's some reports of, you know, better growth rates and so on with them. We don't do it at the Woodland Trust, I would say, just because our conservation team feel that there's a risk of, you know, using species that are maybe not the right ones in terms of the mycorrhizal species.
As a complete amateur, I'd heard a while ago maybe it was a good thing, and then as the science is advancing, maybe more understanding that there is such a range there. So almost
and that's
one size fits all may not work.
That's the worry. It's sort of, on the face of it, feels like it ought to be a good thing, but as with many of these things, maybe a bit more, you know, complex than we understand at the moment, perhaps.
Okay, couple more to go. We're getting through them very well, thank you. Yorkshire has a lot of dry stone walls. Not sure many will argue with that. Do they affect colonisation from woodlands onto adjacent land?
I thought so, because, you know, if seed is wind blown, it'll get over walls, and if it's carried by other vectors, birds and so on, it'll get there. I've definitely seen natural colonisation happening in areas where you've got stone walls around woodland, so it might prevent some of the you know, mammals that may carry seeds on their feet or whatever, but you know, I think there are plenty of other ways that trees get there.
Moving on to a bit more on the rewilding theme and the presence of animals. What about wild boar or heritage pig breeds and their impact? Do they help? This is a question from Spain, where they do have wild boar.
Do they help inwards or outsidewards? I mean, I could imagine that, you know, I don't know. They would definitely break up the ground, turn the ground over, create a seedbed. You'd need them to move on, otherwise the trees won't establish. So for a very short period of time, I'd imagine they'd be really good, and then after that, you'd maybe not want them coming back in. Yeah.
Okay. Just a comment to part of the discussion before from Rupert, thank you. Best thing to control bracken is to break the stem with a long stick at least once each season around June or July.
So
which is good. I can imagine basically. It's hard work if it's a big area, but
yeah,
that makes an impact. In preparation, perhaps for planting, but could also apply to natural regen. I think it's called screefing. You peel back turf and flip it over. Is that good? Depends. Only applicable to planting?
I think screefing, so my understanding of screefing, which is kind of peeling the turf back, as you say, is that if you're planting, it's over a quite small area. So you're just creating a little planting square for the tree to go in, and it sort of retains a weed-free area around the tree for a while as well. So I think that works quite well. I don't know whether you'd want to do it over a whole site. That would be quite labour intensive to do. Screefing by hand, the way that we would do it for planting, would be really labour intensive.
I've seen it done with machines, and you get long rows
so
then lead to the long rows of planting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you've got to kind of weigh up the you want some disturbance of the soil, but you don't want to be ploughing it in effect, do you? Because that's going to cause massive disturbance and might bring in other more weedy species. So yeah.
Okay. That's 10 out of 10 questions. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sian.
those were some of those were really difficult questions. I'm not sure I've answered them all correctly. I've just done my best from my kind of personal experience.
No, but I think you were honest where you did know and where you maybe weren't quite so clear. Gives people a good guide. There's a comment in the chat about small leaved limes again. Even some of the Woodland Trust UK ISG nurseries have struggled to propagate that from seed.
Yes.
I suspect here's a challenge for one of my heroes, Janet Williner, who's on the call this evening, who's a lady up in Burbridge who goes out on a bike, probably this time of year, and collects tree seed.
Yeah.
Grows it in a back garden, and she was trying to get to 5,000 trees by a significant birthday, and I believe she's well on that way. So,
well, I think if she can find a way to that we could successfully propagate small leaf lime every year, that would be fantastic, because small leaf lime is a species that we've started wanting to plant more because of the loss of ash, and again, it's one of those trees that could be a replacement for ash. And it used to be a lot more common in our woods, centuries ago. But we really just struggle to have enough to plant. So, yeah.
Lovely. Well, we'll hold it there. Thank you again. As I say, I really felt very appropriate for rewilders and for Yorkshire. All the talk about natural processes, very welcome here. So we do appreciate that, and you still coming and giving us the time despite the family event yesterday. To all those who haven't already, do please sign up to our newsletter. About an hour ago, we had a problem with the sign-up mechanism, but John, even while listening to the webinar, has fixed it. So thanks, John, for that. It is free, and there'll be an edition out very soon, which has quite a lot of features about woodland, either stories of projects, woodland creation, funding, those kind of things. So do have a look at that. And sorry, I'm just trying to share screen. I clearly can't talk and operate the computer at the same time. We have another webinar in about 6 weeks, which will be about the Crompton Beaver trial, which is more than 5 years old now, is still going. Kath Bashforth, who has hosted some site visits there for us, which are always very popular and sell out, will be delivering that. Wednesday, the 27th of November. I finally got there in my own head. I didn't want to say the wrong date. So the registration link for that will be out very soon. All I would also say is, as John mentioned earlier, we do rely on donations and grants to keep going. Most of us are volunteers, but if you are able to help us, there's some methods on the screen there. I'll leave the webinar open for a few seconds if anyone wants to add anything to the chat. But otherwise, really heartening to have 70 people joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Do keep engaging with YRN. Email us if you've got suggestions what we should be doing. And we hope to see many of you at our next webinar in November. Thank you.